I used to think the hardest part of losing your family was the moment it happened. The door closing, the silence afterward, the first night you realize no one is going to call. I was wrong. The hardest part is the decade that comes after, when you've rebuilt your life into something quiet and stable and genuinely good. And then your phone rings at 9 on a Tuesday night, and you see your mother's name on the screen, and for one unguarded second, something in your chest lifts. Maybe this is it, you think. Maybe this is the call. It wasn't. It was never going to be. She was crying before I even said hello. Not the soft kind of crying that comes with grief or regret. The panicked kind. The kind that meant someone needed something. She said my brother's name 4 times before she said mine once. I stood in my kitchen, in the house Daniel and I had built together, in the life I had fought for without any of their help, and I listened to my mother explain that Jason had made some mistakes, that there were debts, that the situation had become serious. That family was supposed to come together in hard times. She paused, and then she said, "You've always been the strong one, Emily. You've always been able to manage." I didn't answer right away. I set the phone down on the counter and looked at it for a long moment. The way you look at something that has already hurt you before and is offering to do it again. I thought about a number, a specific number I had saved over 6 years, in an account I'd opened myself, at a bank my parents didn't know about, or so I believe. I thought about the morning I discovered that account was empty. I thought about the way my mother had said, with complete conviction, that I would understand someday. I had never understood. I had simply stopped waiting for an explanation that made sense. I picked the phone back up. "Mom," I said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. But to explain what I said next, I need to go back to a childhood I spent being told that patience was a virtue, that sacrifice was love, and that my job as the older one, as the capable one, as the daughter, was to make room. I made room for 20 years. I need to tell you what it cost me. The first memory I have that I can honestly call unfair involves a birthday cake. I was 7, Jason was 4. It was my birthday. My mother had made a chocolate cake, my favorite, and set it on the kitchen table with 7 candles. I remember the way the kitchen smelled. I remember the tablecloth, yellow with small white flowers, slightly crooked the way it always was. I blew out the candles, and Jason cried because he wanted to blow them out too. My mother looked at me with that particular expression I would come to know extremely well over the next 2 decades. Apologetic, slightly exhausted, already decided. "Emily," she said, "you already blew them out. Let your brother have a turn." My father relit the candles. Jason blew them out. He stopped crying. My parents smiled. I sat at my own birthday table and said nothing, because I already understood, at 7 years old, that saying something would only result in being told I was being selfish. I was not being selfish. I was being 7, and it was my birthday, and those were my candles. But I had also already learned that the fastest way to end an unpleasant situation was to absorb it quietly and move on. I was good at that. Suspiciously good for a child. Looking back, I think my parents interpreted that ability as emotional maturity. It wasn't maturity. It was adaptation. There is a difference, and it took me most of my adult life to understand it. Jason was not a cruel child. I want to be honest about that. He wasn't calculating. He wasn't manipulative in the deliberate way. He was simply a boy who had learned, before he could read, that distress was a tool, and that the adults around him would reorganize the world to eliminate his discomfort. So he used it, not out of malice, out of the simple logic of a child who has never been told no and sees no reason to expect otherwise. When we were given money for the school fair, Jason spent his within the first 10 minutes and then stood next to me with wide eyes until I gave him half of mine. My mother, when I told her that evening, said, "That was very generous of you, Emily." She did not say anything to Jason. When I was 11 and Jason was 8, he broke the handheld game console our grandmother had given me for Christmas. He dropped it in the bathtub. Accidentally, he insisted, though he had been specifically told 3 times not to bring it near water. My parents bought him a new one. Not me, him, a newer model actually. When I asked why, my father said, "You're older. You can be more patient about these things." I did not get a replacement for 4 months, when it was added quietly to my birthday list and treated as a gift rather than a restitution. These are small things. I know they sound small, but small things repeated consistently across years are not small. They are a curriculum. They teach a child exactly what they are worth in the structure of their own family. They teach a child what to expect, what to ask for, whether their disappointment matters. By the time I was 14, I had stopped reporting when things were unfair. There was no point. The outcome was predetermined. Jason needed more. I was capable of less. The math never changed. The summer before our senior year, college acceptance letters arrived at our house within a week of each other. I had been accepted to the state university, a strong program, a reasonable financial aid package, a school I'd chosen carefully with cost in mind, because I had been paying attention to what my family could realistically afford. I'd spent junior year visiting campuses on weekends while working evenings at a cafe 2 miles from our house. I had researched loan structures. I had a spreadsheet. I was 17. I had a spreadsheet about my own financial future because I had learned not to assume. Jason had applied to 4 schools without researching costs. He'd applied to the one he wanted. He told my parents what he wanted, and they told him to go ahead and apply. He was accepted to a private university 3 states away. Full tuition, $42,000 a year. My parents paid it. Every dollar, every semester. They took out loans they shouldn't have. They refinanced the house. My father picked up weekend work at a hardware store, which I only learned about months later. They made it work, as they always made Jason's things work, through a combination of sacrifice and financial improvisation that they never fully explained to either of us. I was told, "We'll help you too when the time comes." I worked evenings and weekends, all 4 years of college. I graduated with a loan balance that took 8 years to clear. Jason lasted 2 semesters. He called home in February of his freshman year and told my parents the school wasn't the right fit. Too stressful. The wrong environment. He wasn't happy. My mother called me that night. Her voice softened with concern for him. I sat on the edge of my dorm room bed, the lamp on the desk behind me, textbooks open on the floor because I had a morning exam, and I listened to her explain that Jason was struggling and that the family needed to support him. She did not ask how I was doing. I had a Tuesday exam at 8 in the morning. She did not ask about that either. The Jason who moved back home was different from the boy who had left. Or maybe he wasn't different. Maybe the distance had simply allowed me to see him more clearly, and coming home had collapsed that perspective back into the familiar blur of daily life. He worked briefly at a gym, then at a sporting goods store, then for a friend's landscaping business that lasted 1 summer before the friend decided he could no longer afford to employ Jason, which Jason described as a betrayal. He drove a car my parents had co-signed for. He ate meals my mother cooked. He paid no rent. When money was short, which was often, my parents gave him what he needed without naming it as a loan. When he asked for more, they found ways to provide it. When he expressed frustration or resentment, they apologized for not doing enough. I watched this from a distance, visiting on holidays, staying for long weekends, sitting at the dinner table where the conversation still naturally organized itself around Jason's situation, Jason's feelings, Jason's next steps. I had finished college by then. I had a job. I had a small apartment. I was handling everything myself, which was noted by my parents occasionally as proof that I didn't need the same level of support. They were right that I was handling it. They did not seem curious about what that handling cost me. It was during this period, around the time I was 24 and Jason was 21, that I met Daniel. He was introduced through a colleague at work. We had dinner and he asked me questions and then listened to the answers. Not performatively, not while thinking about what to say next. He just listened, fully, like the conversation was the only thing happening. I had not, I realized, experienced that very often. We were together for 6 months before I told him most of the family history. Not because I was hiding it, but because it felt like a long and unglamorous story, and I wasn't sure it was interesting. Daniel said it was important, not because it was dramatic, but because it was mine, and because it clearly still lived somewhere behind my eyes when I talked about certain things. He was right. By the time I was 26, I knew I was going to marry him. He proposed on a Wednesday evening in our apartment, with no audience and no performance. Just the two of us and a question that felt less like a surprise and more like the natural conclusion of something we'd been building together. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We sat on the floor afterward and talked about what we wanted. Simple, genuine, our people, a day that felt like us. We opened a savings account the following month. We named it privately the fund. Every month, without fail, we put something in it. We missed vacations. We drove older cars longer than we'd planned. We cooked at home most nights and called it a choice, which it was, but it was also a calculation. Every dollar in that account was a dollar closer to something that felt like ours. Over the next 4 years, we saved $11,000. It wasn't a lavish wedding budget. It was enough. It was exactly enough. And because it was ours, because every dollar of it had been chosen and set aside deliberately, it felt like more than money. It felt like proof that we could build something together, that we knew how to decide on something and work toward it and get there. I was 30 years old, and for the first time, I had something I hadn't been asked to share. Then Jason announced he was getting engaged. His fiance's name was Melissa. She came from money, not old money, not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet, comfortable kind that shows up in small ways. The way she held herself, the neighborhood she'd grown up in, the casual assumption that certain things were simply available if you needed them. Jason had met her at a bar. He'd told the story at the dinner table the first time I met her, laughing, and Melissa had laughed too, and I'd watched my parents watch them with an expression I recognized immediately. Relief. Not happiness for Jason, exactly. Relief that someone had arrived to take the weight. I liked Melissa, actually. That was the uncomfortable part. She was warm and direct and genuinely funny, and she looked at Jason with the kind of uncomplicated affection that suggested she had not yet seen the full picture. I wanted to warn her. I didn't know how. I told myself I was projecting. I smiled through dinner and drove home with Daniel in silence. "You okay?" he asked somewhere on the highway. "I don't know," I said. He didn't push. He reached over and put his hand on mine, and we drove the rest of the way home without talking, which was one of the things I loved most about him. The account alert came on a Thursday morning in October. I was at my desk at work, coffee going cold beside me, halfway through a document that needed to be finished before noon. My phone buzzed. I glanced at it out of habit. The alert was from the bank. Account balance, $214. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, because the number didn't recalibrate into something that made sense. 2 weeks earlier, the balance had been $11,340. My first thought was fraud, card skimming, a breach. I was already pulling up the bank app as I pushed back from my desk, walking toward the hallway for privacy, my heart doing something unpleasant in my chest. The transaction history loaded. There was one transaction, a single withdrawal, $11,112, transferred out 4 days ago on a Sunday at 2:17 in the afternoon. I stood in the hallway outside my office and stared at the screen until my vision went slightly strange at the edges. The account was a joint account. I had opened it with Daniel. We were both listed. We were the only two people who should have had access, except that 2 years ago, when we'd first opened it, my mother had been visiting. She had come with me to the bank for an unrelated errand, something to do with a form that needed a signature, and she had been sitting beside me at the banker's desk when I filled out the account paperwork. I had not given her access, but I had not been careful, either. I had been 28 and trusting and sitting next to my mother, and it had not occurred to me to shield the account number from someone who had never once given me a reason to. I called Daniel. He picked up on the second ring. "Check the account," I said. A pause. The sound of him pulling up his phone. "Emily." His voice had gone very quiet and very careful, the way it does when he's keeping himself steady for my benefit. "What happened?" "I don't know yet," I said. "I think I do. I don't want to say it until I know." It took me 3 days to confirm what I already knew. By the end of that first phone call, my mother had the account number. She had written it down during that bank visit, I found the notepad page later in her kitchen, folded into quarters and tucked behind a recipe box. She had called the bank, claimed she was a co-holder, and been walked through a process she shouldn't have been able to complete. I don't know what she said. I don't know how much of it was true and how much of it was improvised. I know it worked. The money had been transferred to an account in Jason's name. The house he and Melissa were planning to buy, a 3-bedroom on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood with good schools. A purchase that everyone had seemed excited about in a way I hadn't fully understood at the time, had required a down payment, $40,000. My parents had contributed what they had, which wasn't much. Melissa's family had contributed, and then there was a gap, $11,000. My parents had filled it with mine. I drove to their house on a Saturday. Daniel offered to come. I told him no, and he accepted that without argument, which was the right call, because what I needed was to walk into that house and say what I had to say without managing anyone else's emotional state at the same time. My mother was in the kitchen when I arrived. My father was in the living room with the television on. The house smelled the way it always had: coffee and something baked, a candle near the window. Normal, as if nothing had happened, as if $11,000 had not been taken from a savings account without my knowledge or consent. I sat down at the kitchen table. My mother turned from the counter and looked at me, and something in her expression shifted. Not guilt, exactly. Preparation. She had been waiting for this. "You know," I said. It wasn't a question. She set down the dish towel she was holding. "Emily, how did you get into the account?" She sat down across from me. "I wrote down the information when we were at the bank. I didn't plan to use it. But when the situation with Jason's house became urgent, you took my money." "It was a loan," she said immediately. "We're going to pay it back." "It wasn't a loan. A loan requires my agreement. You didn't ask me, because we knew you'd say no." The honesty of that stopped me for a moment. "Yes," I said. "I would have said no because it's my money, because I saved it for my wedding." My father had come in from the living room. He was standing in the doorway, and his face had the particular closed expression he wore when he'd already decided that whatever was about to be said was going to be unreasonable. "Jason needed stability," he said. "I know. I've heard that since I was 7 years old. He's starting a family. So am I." My voice was very level. I had been practicing this in the car. "Daniel and I have been saving that money for 4 years, for our wedding. We missed vacations. We drove a car with 200,000 miles on it until last spring. Every dollar in that account was deliberate. And you took it without asking because you knew I'd say no." My mother's hands were folded on the table. "You're strong, Emily. You've always managed." "Jason." "Don't." I said it quietly. "Please don't finish that sentence." She finished it anyway. "Jason doesn't have your resilience. He needs more support. You know that." I looked at her for a long time. "I built my resilience," I said. "It wasn't a gift. I built it because I had to, because you never offered me the alternative." My father shifted in the doorway. "We did the best we could." "I believe you," I said. "I genuinely believe you did the best you knew how to do, but your best caused real damage. And I need you to understand that, not explain it away." The kitchen was very quiet. My mother looked at the table. My father looked at the wall. Neither of them said they were sorry. Not once, not in any form. Not a direct apology, not an acknowledgement that they had done something wrong, not even a softened version that stopped short of full accountability. They explained. They justified. They referenced Jason's needs and their intentions and the difficulty of the situation and the fact that I was doing fine. Look at me. I was fine. I sat in that kitchen for 22 more minutes. I drove home. I sat in the parking garage of our building for a while, in the car, with the engine off. Then I went upstairs and told Daniel everything. He didn't say much. He made tea, which was his instinct when something was too large for immediate language. And he sat across from me at our kitchen table, which was smaller and less expensive than my parents' table and ours in every way that mattered. And he let me say all of it without interrupting or redirecting or trying to fix anything. When I was done, he said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to stop," I said. "Stop what?" "All of it." I looked at him. "I want to stop being available for this. I want to stop being the one who absorbs everything and gets told she's fine." He nodded slowly. "Okay. I don't want them at the wedding." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said again. "You're not going to push back on that. It's your family," he said. "It's your call. I'll support whatever you decide." I reached across the table and held his hand. I thought about all the years I had spent adapting, accommodating, absorbing. I thought about a birthday cake with 7 candles, relit for someone else. "I'm done," I said, and I meant it. We were married on a Saturday in April, 9 months later. 31 people. A restaurant with a private room and large windows that let in the afternoon light. Simple flowers, white and pale green, nothing elaborate. Daniel's aunt played guitar during the ceremony. We wrote our own vows, which we'd been nervous about and which turned out to be the part everyone cried during. My parents were not there. Jason was not there. Several extended family members had called in the months between my decision and the wedding, variously urging me to reconsider, questioning my perspective, suggesting that I was being dramatic or unforgiving or cold. One aunt left a voicemail that used the phrase, "Family is family," 4 times in under 2 minutes. I did not return most of these calls. I had spent so many years being told to be the bigger person. What I had discovered in the months since my parents' kitchen was that being the bigger person had a cost, and that I had been paying it continuously, without agreement, for my entire life. I did not owe that cost indefinitely. I could simply stop. It turned out to be that uncomplicated. Or rather, it was not uncomplicated at all. There were nights when I woke at 3 in the morning with something heavy behind my sternum, missing not the family I had, but the family I had believed, for years, that I might someday have. Missing the possibility. Grieving the version of them that existed only in the parts of me that had not yet let go. But I did not return to them, and I did not return the calls. And on the day of my wedding, standing in a small room with 31 people who had been chosen, specifically and deliberately, for the quality of their presence, I felt, for the first time in a long time, like exactly enough. Daniel cried during my vows. I had not expected that, and it completely wrecked me, in the best possible way. We danced, until the restaurant politely indicated it was time to leave. We drove home with the windows down. That night, in the quiet of our apartment, I lay in the dark and waited for the guilt to arrive. It didn't. Not that night. Years passed. Not smoothly. Years never pass smoothly. There were hard seasons and good ones, the ordinary accumulation of a life being lived. A promotion, a loss, a move to a house with a yard, a medical scare that resolved itself, the slow recalibration of priorities that comes with getting older and understanding more concretely what you do and don't have time for. I heard about Jason the way you hear about anything you've stepped away from. In pieces, through people who hadn't stepped away, who assumed you'd want to know or who simply couldn't help themselves. He had married Melissa. The house was theirs. He had started a new job, some kind of sales position, which had gone well for a while. I absorbed these updates without comment, filed them somewhere, and moved on. I did not reach out. I did not receive anything from them either. No acknowledgement of the wedding, no card, no call. The silence was total and mutual, and after the first year, no longer painful in any active way. I had stopped waiting for something that was not going to come. And then, one evening, someone who knew someone told me that things with Jason were not going particularly well. And I felt, to my own surprise, almost nothing, which was not cruelty. It was simply the absence of a wound that had finally, after a very long time, closed. The thing about Melissa was that she had genuinely loved him. I believed that. I believed it when I met her, and I believe it now, and it makes the whole story worse in a way that a simpler narrative wouldn't allow for. If she had been naive or careless or willfully blind, the ending would be easier to categorize. But she was none of those things. She was intelligent and warm, and she had done what reasonable people do when they fall in love with someone. She had trusted him. She had trusted him with the version of himself he'd chosen to present. What she didn't know, when she signed the mortgage papers on the East Side house, was that Jason had come into that marriage carrying debt she hadn't been told about. Not a small amount. Not the kind that could be explained by bad luck or a rough patch. The kind that accumulates over years of spending money you don't have on things you can't afford, and then moving it around quietly, from account to account, in the way that people do when they've gotten skilled at postponing consequences. She didn't know about the gambling. That one took longest to surface. It wasn't casino gambling, nothing that visible. It was the online kind, the kind you do at 2 in the morning on your phone in the bathroom with the door locked, the kind that leaves no physical evidence and requires only a credit card and a willingness to believe, against all available probability, that the next one will be different. She didn't know about the second credit card, or the third. She didn't know that the car he drove, a model newer than anything he'd actually earned, was financed at an interest rate that made the monthly payment a slow disaster. What she knew was that he was charming and funny, and that he looked at her like she was solving something for him, which it turned out she was. The divorce papers were filed 18 months after the wedding. I learned about this from my cousin Rachel, who was still in contact with my parents, and who called me on a Sunday afternoon with the particular energy of someone delivering news they find genuinely upsetting, but also cannot resist sharing. Melissa found everything, Rachel said. I was in the kitchen. I set down the knife I'd been using to cut vegetables. Everything, I said. The debt, the gambling accounts. Apparently there's a credit card she'd never heard of that's completely maxed out. She found statements. She hired an attorney the same week. I was quiet for a moment. How are my parents taking it? Rachel made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Your mom is devastated. She keeps saying Melissa never really understood Jason, that if she'd been more patient. Right, I said. Emily, I know, it's just... I stopped. There was nothing useful to say that I hadn't already said in a kitchen 3 states away to 2 people who had not been listening. Your dad is trying to figure out how to keep them from losing the house, Rachel continued. The mortgage is behind. Jason apparently hasn't been making the full payment for a while. He's been telling Melissa he was handling it. How far behind? She told me. I closed my eyes briefly. The house that had been purchased, in part, with $11,000 taken from my wedding account, was 4 months behind on its mortgage payments. Your parents are going to try to help, Rachel said. Your dad mentioned the retirement account. I didn't say anything. Emily, are you? I'm fine, I said. Thank you for telling me. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a while, the half-cut vegetables on the board in front of me, the afternoon light moving across the counter. I did not feel victorious. I want to be precise about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the narrator describes this moment as satisfying, as proof, as justice arriving on schedule. It didn't feel like that. It felt like watching something that had been inevitable for a very long time finally happen, and finding that the arrival of the inevitable is almost never as clarifying as you expect it to be. It felt like grief, with nowhere particular to land. My parents used the retirement account. Not all of it. Enough of it that the difference would matter later, when later arrived. They negotiated with the mortgage company. They paid the arrears. They kept Jason in the house, even though Melissa was no longer in it, even though the marriage was over, even though the thing that had made the house meaningful, the stability, the family, the future Melissa had believed she was building, was gone. Jason stayed in the house. My parents explained this to Rachel, who explained it to me as a matter of basic support. He needed somewhere stable. He was going through a difficult time. The divorce had been hard on him. Nobody mentioned that the divorce had been Melissa's decision, made after she discovered that the person she'd married had been systematically lying to her about their finances for the entire duration of their relationship. Nobody framed it that way. The framing was, Jason was struggling, which was true. The part they left out was why. He kept the job for another 7 months after the divorce. Then that ended, officially because of a restructuring, unofficially because of something that came out later in pieces. A complaint from a client, an investigation that was settled quietly and without admission of wrongdoing, the kind of corporate language that tends to appear when the truth is worse than the official version, but not quite actionable. He moved out of the house eventually, when even my parents' supplements couldn't bridge the gap between what he owed and what he had. He rented an apartment, a cheaper one, then a cheaper one after that. He worked various jobs in this period, none of which lasted long enough to describe. Sales positions mostly. Roles that relied on personality and charm over anything that could be verified or measured. which was where his skills were most transferable. My parents continued to help. Every time they helped, I knew the help became both more necessary and less effective. Not because help is inherently harmful. I don't believe that. But because the particular kind of help my parents offered had never been connected to any expectation of change. There were no conditions. There was no conversation about what had gone wrong or what Jason might do differently. There was only the money, transferred quietly, accompanied by the understanding that it would be needed again. And it always was. I heard about the gambling again through Rachel, who heard it from my mother. It had never stopped. The divorce, the job loss, the apartment downgrades, none of it had interrupted the pattern. If anything, the pattern had intensified, which is what patterns tend to do when the underlying need is emotional rather than financial, and the only treatment being offered is cash. There was a period, Rachel told me, when Jason had borrowed money from friends. Some of it returned, most of it not. There were relationships that ended over it. A friendship that had lasted since high school gone. My parents paid off what they could. The retirement account took several more withdrawals. My father, who was 63 by this point, picked up additional work. I don't know exactly what kind. Rachel mentioned it only briefly, in a tone that suggested she found it painful to say. My mother, I was told, had stopped talking about Jason the way she used to. She still defended him when pressed. But the quality of the defense had shifted. It was less confident now, more reflexive. The way you repeat something you've been saying for so long that you've stopped examining whether it's still true. I did not reach out. I thought about it. More than once, I picked up my phone with some half-formed idea of calling. Not to repair anything. Not to pretend that years of silence could simply be folded back into normalcy. But because they were my parents, and because whatever had happened between us, they were aging and tired, and in the middle of something that was clearly getting worse. I put the phone down every time, not out of cruelty, out of self-preservation, and also out of honesty, because I knew, with the deep bone knowledge of someone who has tested this particular dynamic many times, that if I called, the conversation would not be about repair. It would be about Jason. It would be about what I could do. And I had spent my entire life being that conversation, and I was no longer available for it. The criminal matter was the last thing Rachel told me before my mother called herself. I'm not going to detail it completely, because some of it was still unresolved at the time and because the specifics, the financial instruments involved, the clients who had been affected, the amounts, are less important than the fact of it. What I will say is that it was not a mistake. It was not a moment of poor judgment or an impulsive decision made under pressure. It was a pattern of behavior, conducted deliberately over a period of time, in which Jason had taken money from people who trusted him and used it in ways they had not agreed to. There were multiple parties. There was a federal component. There was, as of the week before my mother's phone call, an ongoing investigation. Rachel delivered this information in a voice that was very quiet and very careful. The way you speak when you're saying something that has weight, and you want to make sure it lands correctly. I thanked her. I sat in the kitchen, my kitchen, in the house Daniel and I owned, in the life I had built without any of their help. And I thought about a boy who had been told, from the very beginning, that consequences were something other people handled. I thought about my parents' retirement account, what remained of it. I thought about Melissa, somewhere on the other side of the city, who had rebuilt something and was probably fine now, but who had lost years to a man who had not been honest with her about anything that mattered. I thought about $11,000. My phone buzzed on the counter. Mom, the screen said. I looked at it for a long time. Then I answered. She was crying before I said anything. Not the soft kind. The other kind. The kind that comes out ragged and slightly embarrassing. The kind that people don't choose. That arrives because something has finally broken through whatever they'd been using to hold themselves together. Emily. My name in her voice sounded different than it used to. Smaller, like it cost something. Mom, I kept my voice even. What's happening? She told me in pieces, the way frightened people tell things out of order, circling back, losing the thread and finding it again. Jason. The investigation. An attorney they couldn't afford. Debts she named and some she didn't. The retirement account, which I already knew about but which sounded different in her voice than it had in Rachel's. Smaller, more final. The way a number sounds when it belongs to someone who is 67 and tired. I stood at the kitchen counter and listened. I did not interrupt. When she had finished, or run out of immediate momentum, there was a pause. Then she said, "You've done so well, Emily. You and Daniel, you've always been so capable." I recognized the architecture of this sentence immediately. I had heard it my entire life in various forms, deployed at various moments, always preceding the same conclusion. "We thought," she continued carefully, "that maybe you might be able to help, even a portion of what's needed. It would give us time to figure out." "Mom," I said. She stopped. "I need you to hear me say something. Not as a response to what you're asking, before we get there. I need you to actually hear it." A small sound. Agreement or something close to it. I moved to the kitchen table and sat down. Outside the window, the yard was dark. Daniel was upstairs. The house was quiet in the way it gets on weeknights. Settled, familiar, the particular silence of a life that has been deliberately constructed and carefully maintained. "When I was 26 years old," I said, "I opened a savings account. Daniel and I put money into it every month for 4 years. We skipped things. We made choices. We were saving for our wedding." "Emily, I'm not finished." She was quiet. "You took $11,000 from that account without telling me, without asking. You told me later that you hadn't asked because you knew I'd say no." I paused. "Do you remember saying that?" A long silence. "Yes," she said finally. "I want to make sure we're both clear on what happened. You knew it was wrong. You knew I would refuse. And you did it anyway because Jason needed it and because you believed I would absorb it. The way I had always absorbed things." The crying on the other end of the line had gone quiet. She was listening. Actually listening, I thought, not waiting to respond, not preparing her defense, but listening in the way that people sometimes do when they've run out of alternatives. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I want you to try to answer it honestly." "Okay." In all the years since that happened, since I stopped coming home, since I stopped calling, since I missed every holiday and sent no cards and built my entire life without either of you in it, did you ever think about why?" The silence stretched. "We thought you were angry," she said. "I was angry. That's not what I'm asking. Did you ever think about whether you had done something that warranted it?" Another silence, longer. "We thought we were doing what was best for the family." "I know," I said. "I know that's what you thought. I've spent a long time understanding that you weren't trying to hurt me. You genuinely believed that what you were doing was right." I stopped. "But here's what I need you to understand. Your belief in your own good intentions did not protect me from the consequences of your choices. It just meant I suffered them without even receiving an acknowledgement that suffering had occurred." She made a sound that wasn't a word. "You told me I was strong," I continued. "My whole life, that's what you told me. Emily is strong. Emily can manage. Emily doesn't need as much. But Mom, you didn't build my strength. I built it. I built it because I had to. Because every time there was something difficult, you arranged the world so that Jason wouldn't have to face it, and then you turned to me and said, 'You can handle this. You always can.'" My voice was steady. I had not planned this. I had not rehearsed it in any deliberate way, but it had been sitting in me for 10 years, and it knew its own shape. "He couldn't handle anything," I said. "Not because he was weak, but because you never let him try. Every time he was about to learn something about consequences, about responsibility, about what it costs to make poor decisions, you stepped in. You absorbed it for him. The same way you expected me to absorb things for all of you." I heard her breath catch. "And now he's under federal investigation. And your retirement account is gone. And you're calling me not to apologize, not to acknowledge what happened 10 years ago, but to ask if I can help." Again. The word landed and sat there. "I'm not angry anymore," I said. "I want you to know that. What I am is tired and sad, and very, very clear on what happened and why. Emily," her voice was barely there, "I'm sorry. I waited." "I'm sorry," she said again. It came out differently the second time. Less like a phrase and more like something that had been held underwater for a long time and finally surfaced. "I don't know if that matters now, but I am." I looked at the table in front of me, thought about a birthday cake. a hand-drawn note in a recipe box, a number on a phone screen that had taken the air out of a hallway. "It matters," I said. "It's not enough to change what happened, but it matters." Jason was arrested 11 days later. I learned about it the same way I'd learned about most things, through Rachel, who called on a Wednesday morning with a voice that had shed all of its usual social scaffolding and gone flat and direct. The charges were serious: wire fraud, multiple counts. The investigation had been ongoing for over a year, and the federal case was, by Rachel's account, not one that left much room for optimistic interpretation. My parents had not known the full extent of it until the arrest. That part I believed. I believed that whatever my mother had shared on the phone had been the version she understood, which was incomplete, because Jason had spent his entire life making sure the people who loved him only ever saw the version he'd curated. He had learned that early. He had learned it from watching what worked. Rachel told me that my father had cried. She said this in a tone that suggested it was significant, that it was not something she had witnessed before or expected to witness. My father was not a man who cried easily. He was a man who problem-solved, who went quiet when things were difficult, who expressed his emotional state primarily through action. There was nothing to do here. There was no fix, no negotiation, no account to drain or favor to call in or bridge to build. The son he had spent 40 years protecting had arrived at a place that protection could not reach. I sat with that for a while. I did not call them. I told Daniel that night at dinner, and he listened the way he always listened, with his full attention and without rushing toward resolution. "How are you doing?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. "I don't know how to feel relieved and heartbroken at the same time," I said. "But that's what it is." He nodded. "Both of those make sense," he said. I reached across the table. He held my hand. Outside, it had started to rain. My parents called 3 weeks after the arrest. Not my mother alone this time. Both of them. My father's voice on the line, which was rarer than my mother's and which carried, in its unfamiliarity, a weight that her voice no longer had the capacity to carry. They wanted to see me. Not to ask for anything, my mother said carefully. Not for money, not for help with Jason's situation. They understood, she said, that there was nothing I could do there, and they weren't calling to suggest otherwise. They wanted to see me. I told them I would think about it. I talked to Daniel that night for a long time. He didn't tell me what to do. He asked me what I was afraid of, and what I wanted, and whether those two things were in conflict, and what I would need to feel okay regardless of how the visit went. I drove to their house on a Saturday afternoon in November. The drive was 2 hours. I listened to music for the first hour and nothing for the second, which I needed. The house looked smaller than I remembered. That is the thing that happens, I think, when you've been gone long enough, the geography of childhood contracts. The rooms that once seemed enormous reveal themselves as ordinary. The kitchen table where so much had happened was just a table. My parents looked older. Of course they did. It had been 10 years, plus the specific aging that comes from sustained worry and grief, and the collapse of something you'd spent your whole life building toward. My mother stood in the doorway when I pulled up. She was thinner. She held herself differently, not with the particular confident warmth she'd always projected, but with something more careful, more tentative. My father stood behind her. We sat in the living room. My mother had made coffee. There were pastries on a plate that I recognized from a bakery 2 streets over. She had always bought them for occasions she considered important. The gesture was small, and it broke something open in me that I hadn't fully expected. We talked for a while about ordinary things first. The house. My job. Daniel, who had sent his regards and who they received carefully, without the defensiveness that might have been there years ago. Then the ordinary things ran out. My mother looked at her hands. "We made you carry things that weren't yours to carry," she said. I didn't respond immediately. "From the beginning," she continued. Her voice was careful and slow, the voice of someone reading from a document they've been working on for a long time. "We told you that you were strong, and we used your strength. And we told Jason he needed protection, and we gave him so much protection that he never—" She stopped. Her jaw worked slightly. "He never became someone who could stand on his own." My father was looking at the window. His profile, in the afternoon light, was someone I had known my entire life, and was still in the process of understanding. "We thought we were being good parents," he said, not defensive, just stating it the way you state something you've examined until its meaning has changed. "We thought caring for someone meant removing difficulty from their path." "I know," I said. "We didn't understand that we were doing it at your expense." "You did a little," I said. "I think you knew, somewhere, that it wasn't fair. I think that's why you told me I was strong so often. It made it easier to believe you weren't asking too much." Neither of them argued with that. The room was very quiet. "I'm not going to pay Jason's legal fees," I said. "I want to be clear about that, not because I want him to suffer, but because I've learned from watching all of this that there is a version of help that doesn't actually help." My mother nodded. "I'm also not going to disappear again," I said. "Not because everything is fixed. It isn't. But because you're my parents and you're getting older and I don't want to spend the rest of my life making my point at the expense of the time we have left." My father looked at me then. He had the expression of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told, cautiously, that he may set it down. "I can help you find a doctor," I said. "And if it gets to the point where you need more assisted living support, whatever that looks like, I'll help arrange it. Not because you've earned it, but because that's who I want to be." My mother's eyes filled. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "We spent our whole lives trying to protect Jason." I nodded. My father looked down at his hands. "And we never realized," he said, barely above a whisper, "that we were protecting him from becoming a man." The room held that sentence. I stood up. I crossed to where my mother was sitting and bent down and kissed her forehead. The way you do with someone who is tired and small and genuinely sorry, and genuinely too late and genuinely yours anyway. Then I walked to the door, and for the first time in my life, I left that house without the particular weight that had lived behind my ribs for as long as I could remember. Not because it was resolved, not because anyone had been saved, but because I had finally, completely, stopped waiting for their love to look the way I'd always needed it to look. I had my own life. I had Daniel. I had the house with the yard, and the table where we ate dinner, and the account we'd rebuilt together after everything, and the 31 people at our wedding who had been chosen for the quality of their presence. I had enough. I had always been enough. I just hadn't been told. My parents spent 20 years saving my brother from consequences. Every rescue, every covered debt, every redirected blame, they did it with love. I've made my peace with that. The love was real. But love without limits is not protection. It is permission. Permission to stay small. Permission to stay broken. Permission to take and never be asked to give anything back. Not accountability, not honesty, not the basic dignity of facing what you've done. In the end, consequences were the only thing that could have saved my brother. And by the time my parents understood that, by the time they sat in their smaller-looking living room with their older-looking faces and said the things they had never been able to say before, it was too late for Jason. But it was not too late for me. It had never been too late for me. I had just needed to stop asking their permission to believe that.